The sun hung heavy in the sky, an orange inferno casting waves of heat over everything it touched. My little stall stood on the side of the road, humble but sturdy, with bottles of milk lined up like soldiers in formation. The wood beneath my fingers felt hot, even through the layers of sweat and calluses that years of farm work had built on my hands. It had been another long day, the kind that seemed to stretch endlessly, like the horizon itself. I glanced at the bottles of milk, still half full, and not enough customers in sight. I let out a sigh, tugging the brim of my sun hat lower to block the glare. It wasn't just the heat that was weighing me down. My roof had sprung another leak last week, the kind that would take more than a tarp and a prayer to fix. Jack, my neighbor, had offered to help patch it up, but I still needed to buy the supplies. And God knows, money wasn't easy to come by these days. Come on, Emma, just a few more sales. I whispered to myself, setting my jaw and turning my attention back to the road, hoping against hope that a few more cars would slow down. But the road was quiet now, as if the world had paused to catch its breath. Even the usual chatter from the other vendors had died down. The afternoon was slipping away. That's when I saw him. At first, he was just a speck in the distance, barely visible through the shimmering heat rising from the asphalt. But as he got closer, the figure became clearer. A boy, no older than 12, wearing clothes a size too big for him, the sleeves of his shirt hanging past his wrists. He had a nervous energy about him, glancing back and forth as if he was expecting someone but afraid of what he might find. He stumbled toward the bus stop just a little ways down from where I was set up. When he sat down, I saw the slump of his shoulders, the way his hands gripped his knees. It was the posture of someone lost, both in place and in spirit. I watched him for a minute, my heart stirring with a sense of unease. Something wasn't right. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days, skinny as a rail, eyes hollowed out by something more than just hunger. Every now and then, he'd glance at the road, hope flickering in his eyes whenever a car passed by, only to fade again when none of them stopped. I couldn't just stand there. With a deep breath, I grabbed a bottle of milk and a packet of cheese pancakes from my stand. The milk felt cold against my hand, a small contrast to the heat radiating from the ground. As I walked toward him, I saw the way his eyes darted up, wide and suspicious, like a cornered animal not sure whether to run or trust the hand reaching out. "Hey there," I called softly, trying not to startle him. "You look like you could use something to eat." He blinked at me, his face a mask of confusion and wariness. Up close, he looked even younger than I'd thought, his cheeks pale beneath the grime. His lips moved, but no words came out at first. "It's all right," I said gently, holding out the milk and the food. "Go ahead, it's yours." Hesitation flickered in his eyes, but hunger won out. He took the food, muttering something that sounded like a thank you. He tore into the pancakes with a ferocity that made me wonder just how long it had been since his last meal. I sat down beside him, wiping my hands on my apron. "What's your name, sweetheart?" I asked after a moment, trying to keep my voice light, even though my heart was heavy with worry. Kids like him didn't just show up at bus stops, alone and starving, unless something was very wrong. "Ethan," he said between bites, his voice barely a whisper. "Ethan, huh? Where are you headed?" His chewing slowed, and he glanced at the road again. "To my dad's," he mumbled, like the words were something he wasn't sure he was allowed to say. "I've got to get to him. He's the only one who can help." There was a sadness in the way he said it, the kind that didn't belong in a boy's voice. I felt my stomach twist, sensing that whatever had driven him here was more than just a missed bus. "Where's your mom?" I asked gently, not wanting to pry, but needing to understand. He looked away, swallowing hard. She's back with her family. After the divorce. But they're not nice to me. I couldn't stay there anymore. I felt my heart break a little more with each word he spoke. It wasn't the first time I'd heard a story like his. A lot of kids in this town got caught up in the fallout of broken homes, shuffled around like they were just another piece of baggage in the mess. "So you're trying to get to your dad's," I said softly, watching the way his small hands clutched the milk like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Do you have money for the bus?" He shook his head, eyes cast downward in shame. I tried asking the driver, but they wouldn't let me on without a ticket. I don't know what to do. I just want to get to him. My mind raced. I had just over $30 from the few sales I had made today, not nearly enough to cover my roof repairs or anything else. But looking at Ethan, alone and desperate, I knew I couldn't let him walk away with nothing. "Wait here a second," I said, standing up. I hurried back to my stall, my hand shaking a little as I fished a crisp $20 bill from my apron pocket. The last thing I could afford was to give it away, but what else could I do? When I returned, I knelt down beside him again and held out the money. "Here, this'll get you to your dad's." His eyes widened as he stared at the bill, disbelief written all over his face. For a second, I thought he might refuse, but then he grabbed it, his small hands clutching it tight like it was a lifeline. You're giving this to me." His voice trembled, as if kindness was something he hadn't experienced in a long time. "Yeah," I said with a soft smile. "Just make sure you get to your dad safe, okay?" Before I knew it, he'd thrown his arms around me, holding me tight in a way that caught me off guard. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't forget this, I promise." As he sprinted toward the bus that had just pulled in, I watched him go, my heart both heavy and light. I didn't know if I'd ever see him again, but I prayed that wherever that bus took him, it would be someplace safe. And as the bus disappeared over the hill, a small hand waving out the window, I found myself whispering a silent prayer for him. "Lord, keep him safe, please." Little did I know, that small act of kindness was about to change my life in ways I could never have imagined. The day started like most others, with the same cracked alarm clock buzzing me awake at 4:30 a.m., the faint smell of hay and old wood drifting through the open window, and the cold, damp air creeping in through the gaps in the walls. Greenfield Farm had been my life for 35 years, but lately it felt more like a prison than a home. The paycheck, when it came, barely covered the basics, and most days I was left wondering how I'd manage to keep the lights on. The farm was changing, and not for the better. The new farm manager, Michael Torrance, was the worst of it. He had been brought in by the owners, rich folks who lived too far away to care about what happened to the people who worked for them. Michael acted like he owned the place, strutting around in his shiny shoes and expensive watch, barking orders at everyone. He wasn't like Mr. Greenfield, the old owner who'd known each of us by name and treated us like family. Michael didn't care about loyalty, hard work, or the years we'd spent sweating in the fields. To him, we were just numbers in a ledger, and I was starting to feel like I was in the red. That morning, as I made my way to the barn, I noticed the cracks in the walls of my house seemed bigger, the roof sagging lower. It had been leaking for months now, and with every new storm, the damage got worse. I had asked Michael for help with the repairs. After all, I'd worked for the farm for over 3 decades, but my request had fallen on deaf ears. The farm wasn't what it used to be. Paychecks were late more often than not, and there was a tension in the air, like a storm was brewing just beyond the horizon. I had hoped today would be different. I had saved enough pride to march up to that sleek office of Michael's one last time, hoping against hope that he might listen. As I crossed the field toward the farmhouse, my boots crunching on the gravel, I steeled myself for what I had to do. Michael's office was an eyesore in itself, a glass-walled box that looked out of place on the farm, like a corporate trophy dropped in the middle of the dirt. I hated the sight of it, hated how it represented everything wrong with Greenfield now, but I had no choice. I knocked once, and without waiting for an answer, I pushed open the door. The smell of leather and polished wood hit me first, followed by the sight of Michael lounging behind his massive desk, flipping through some papers like he had all the time in the world. He didn't even look up when I entered. "Michael," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though my hands were shaking with frustration. "We need to talk." Finally, he glanced up, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Emma, what a surprise." I thought I heard the clomping of boots. His tone was condescending, like he was talking to a stubborn child. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to stay calm. "I've worked here for 35 years, I began, standing tall, even though my knees felt like jelly. I've done everything that's ever been asked of me, and I've never complained. But this farm isn't what it used to be. We're not getting paid on time, and my house, it's falling apart, Michael. I need help fixing it. I've earned that much. Michael leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against his lips, the smirk never leaving his face. Emma, times have changed. This isn't the Greenfield farm you remember. We're running a business here, and businesses need to make cuts where necessary. I'm afraid there's nothing I can do. Besides, if you need something, you should have something to trade. The words stung like a slap in the face. I clenched my fists, the years of swallowed pride boiling to the surface. Trade? I've given my life to this place. What more could I possibly have to give? Michael's eyes darkened, his smirk vanishing as he leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk. Loyalty doesn't pay the bills, Emma. Dedication doesn't put money in the bank. You want something from the farm? You need leverage. What exactly are you offering? The way he said it made my skin crawl. There was a coldness in his eyes, a predator's gaze, and in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. Michael didn't just want to run the farm into the ground. He wanted to break the people who worked it. He thrived on power, control, and making us feel small. I slammed my fists down on his desk before I could stop myself. You think Mr. Greenfield would have approved of this? Of you turning away his longest-serving worker like trash? His eyes narrowed, and for a second, I thought I saw a flicker of fear, but it was gone as fast as it appeared. Mr. Greenfield isn't here anymore. I am. I couldn't take it anymore. The humiliation, the anger, it all crashed over me like a wave, and before I knew it, I had turned on my heel and stormed out of his office. I could hear him chuckling behind me as I slammed the door, my heart pounding with a mixture of rage and despair. As I stumbled into the parking lot, blinking back tears, I heard my name being called. Emma! Emma, wait. I turned to see Margaret, my old friend and former coworker, hurrying toward me. She had retired a few years back, but we had remained close. Her weathered face was lined with concern as she reached out, placing a hand on my arm. What happened? She asked, her voice soft, though I could hear the tension in it. Are you all right? I shook my head, the tears finally spilling over as I collapsed into her arms. I told her everything, about the late pay, the house falling apart, and Michael's cruelty. She listened, her own face growing tight with anger. That man's a devil, she muttered under her breath. He's gonna get what's coming to him, you'll see. I wanted to believe her, but standing there in the parking lot, my spirit felt crushed. As she helped me into her rusty pickup truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was at play. Greenfield Farm was rotting from the inside out, and we were all trapped in its decay. We rode in silence through the dusty countryside, the setting sun casting long shadows over the fields. The sky was a brilliant orange, but I couldn't find any beauty in it. All I could think about was the years I had given to that farm and how it had abandoned me when I needed it most. When we pulled up to my house, I saw the cracks in the walls more clearly than ever. The roof was sagging, and there were spots where the wood had begun to rot. It felt like a reflection of me, worn down, broken, and barely holding together. Come on, let's get you inside, Margaret said gently, helping me out of the truck. We'll figure this out. You're not alone. But as I stared at my crumbling home, I couldn't help but feel that I was. Alone and forgotten, just like the old farm itself. Little did I know, the tides were about to turn in a way I could never have expected. The next morning, I was up before dawn, just like always, but the weight of the previous day still hung heavy in my chest. The confrontation with Michael had left me drained, more so than I wanted to admit. I sat on the front porch, nursing a chipped cup of coffee, the kind that's more bitter than it should be. The sun had barely begun to creep over the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields. It was quiet, too quiet. My old house creaked in the wind, its sagging roof and peeling paint a constant reminder of the years of wear. I hadn't had the energy to even think about repairs. What good would it do? I didn't have the money, and the farm sure as hell wasn't going to help. It felt like everything around me was falling apart, physically and otherwise. I was so lost in thought that I almost didn't hear the low rumble of an engine in the distance. At first, I thought it was just one of the usual farm trucks or maybe Margaret coming by to check on me. But as the sound grew closer, I realized it wasn't any ordinary vehicle. The hum of an expensive car engine rolled through the air like an omen, smooth and powerful, out of place on the dirt road leading to my rundown home. I stood, squinting down the long drive. A sleek black Mercedes appeared, cutting through the dust like a knife. My heart raced. What the hell was a car like that doing here? Was it more bad news? Had Michael sent someone to finish what his words had started? As the car pulled into my driveway, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The kind of car you only see in magazines or parked outside country clubs, not in front of a beat-up house like mine. For a moment, I considered retreating inside, but something kept me planted there on the porch. Curiosity mixed with a growing sense of unease. The car came to a stop, and two men stepped out. The first was older, probably in his late 50s or early 60s, wearing a sharp, tailored suit that made him look like he belonged in a boardroom, not a farm. His face was serious, but there was a kindness in his eyes, something that made me hesitate before jumping to conclusions. The second man was younger, maybe in his early 30s, dressed in jeans and a button-down shirt that, despite its casualness, looked like it cost more than my entire monthly pay. He had a quiet confidence about him, the kind that comes from someone who's seen the world and knows where they stand in it. But there was something else, something familiar in the way he moved. I watched as they exchanged a few words, the younger man gesturing toward me. He turned, his eyes locking onto mine, and for a split second, time seemed to freeze. His face, there was something about it that stirred a memory, something I hadn't thought about in years. Then he smiled. "Miss Emma?" he called, his voice warm, filled with the kind of recognition that sent shivers down my spine. I blinked, trying to piece together how this man, this stranger, knew my name. I hadn't been called Miss Emma in years, not since the old days when people still had respect for the workers at Greenfield. But there was something in his voice, something that tugged at the edges of a distant memory. And then it hit me like lightning out of a clear sky. It couldn't be. "Ethan?" I whispered, my voice barely audible as the pieces clicked into place. The boy from the bus stop. The skinny, wide-eyed kid I had given food and bus fare to all those years ago. But this wasn't the same boy. This was a man, tall, strong, and confident. The same boy who had clung to me in gratitude that day had returned, standing in front of me like a ghost from my past. Ethan's smile widened, and he took a few steps toward me, closing the distance. "It's me, Miss Emma, from the bus stop. I told you I'd come back, didn't I?" I couldn't believe it. The boy I'd helped so many years ago, the boy I'd never thought I'd see again, was standing in my driveway. And not just standing, he looked successful, like he'd made something of himself. Tears welled in my eyes, but I quickly blinked them away, not wanting to break down in front of him. "Ethan, I can't believe it's you," I stammered, my voice thick with emotion. "What are you doing here?" Ethan chuckled softly, his hands shoved into his pockets as he looked around at the old house, the fields beyond, and the long stretch of road that led back to town. "I made a promise to you that day. I told you I'd come back and see you again. Took me a little longer than I planned, but I kept my word." He turned, gesturing to the older man standing behind him. "This is my father, James. He helped me track you down." James stepped forward, his expression softening as he removed his hat in a respectful gesture. "Mrs. Emma, it's an honor to meet you. My son's told me everything you did for him. We've been looking for you for a while." I felt like I was caught in some strange dream, standing there on my front porch, talking to this grown man who used to be the hungry, scared boy I'd given a second chance to. It didn't seem real. How could something so small, so insignificant in the grand scheme of things, bring him back to me like this? "Come inside, come inside," I said, my hands trembling as I waved them toward the door. "You must be tired from your trip." As we walked into my small, dilapidated home, I saw the way Ethan's eyes lingered on the peeling wallpaper, the sagging ceiling, and the cracks in the walls. It was impossible to miss, the signs of a house that had been neglected for too long. My cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but I tried to push the feeling aside. What was I going to do? This was my life, and it wasn't something I could fix overnight. We sat around the rickety dining table, steaming mugs of tea between us. The silence stretched for a moment before Ethan leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Miss Emma, what happened?" "The farm. Are they not helping you with the house?" I couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped my lips. "The farm? They can't even manage to pay us on time anymore. Asking for help with repairs is like asking for the moon." Ethan's expression darkened, a look of anger flashing across his face. "That's not right. After all the years you've worked for them, they should be helping you." His father, James, exchanged a glance with Ethan, something unspoken passing between them. I could see the wheels turning in their heads, but I didn't know what they were planning. "Aunt Emma," Ethan said softly, using the name with a warmth that surprised me. "We didn't just come here to visit. Dad and I have been talking, and we want to help you. You gave me more than just a bus ticket that day. You gave me hope. It's time we gave something back." Before I could protest, Ethan stood up, pulling out his phone. "Dad and I are going to stay in town for a few days. I've already called a contractor. We're going to fix this place up, make it right. You won't have to worry about a thing." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell them I couldn't possibly accept such generosity, but the words wouldn't come. The kindness, the unexpected act of returning what I had given, overwhelmed me. I had been so used to carrying everything on my own for so long. I didn't know how to let someone else take the weight off my shoulders. As Ethan made a call, James leaned toward me, his voice low and serious. "Mrs. Emma, I've got some business to take care of too. I'm not sure what's going on at the farm, but I'm going to find out. It sounds like things aren't right, and I've got a few contacts who can help look into it. We'll make sure they don't get away with this." I stared at him, the words barely registering. Help? Real help? From people who cared? I felt like I was on the verge of tears again, but this time they weren't from sadness or frustration. They were from a sense of relief I hadn't felt in years. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. The next morning, I woke to a sound I hadn't heard in years, hammering. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. I lay there for a moment, blinking in confusion as the rhythmic pounding filtered through the thin walls of my bedroom. It wasn't the usual groans and creaks of my old house settling under the weight of time and neglect. No, this was something different. This was the sound of change. When I finally rolled out of bed and stepped outside, the scene that greeted me was like something out of a movie. My yard, which had long been overgrown with weeds and wild grass, was swarming with workers. Men in hard hats were everywhere, some climbing ladders, others hauling in supplies. The soft hum of machinery filled the air, mixing with the clatter of tools and the buzz of conversation. The scent of fresh lumber mingled with the familiar smells of earth and hay. And there, in the middle of it all, stood Ethan, his arms crossed over his chest, a satisfied smile on his face as he watched the transformation unfold. "Morning, Aunt Emma," he called out, waving at me from the driveway. He was standing next to a man with a clipboard, deep in conversation about what I could only assume were the details of the repairs. "You're just in time to see the magic happen." I blinked, still trying to wrap my head around the whirlwind of activity that had overtaken my once quiet home. "Ethan, what in the world is going on?" He grinned, making his way over to me with that same easy confidence I remembered from the day before. "Like I told you, we're getting this place fixed up. Joe here." He gestured to the man with the clipboard, who gave me a polite nod. "Is the best contractor in the county. He's going to make sure everything's done right. Roof, walls, plumbing. You name it, we'll fix it." I shook my head, feeling a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "But I can't afford any of this, Ethan. You know that." Ethan put a gentle hand on my shoulder, his eyes warm and sincere. "Don't you worry about that. My dad and I are covering it. You gave me a second chance when I needed it most, and this is just our way of repaying you. You deserve to live in a house that's fit for someone as kind as you." I opened my mouth to protest again, but the words caught in my throat. How could I argue with someone so determined to help? someone who had clearly come back into my life with the sole purpose of making it better. I had spent so many years struggling to keep things together on my own. I didn't know how to let someone else take the burden off my shoulders. But standing there, watching the workers swarm around my house, I realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know how to ever repay you." Ethan smiled, his hand still resting lightly on my shoulder. "You don't have to repay me, Aunt Emma. You already did, years ago." As the day wore on, the noise from the construction site became a comforting backdrop to my daily routine. Every time I glanced outside, I saw something new. Planks of fresh wood being nailed into place, shingles being replaced on the roof, gutters being cleared of the debris that had clogged them for years. The house was slowly coming back to life, piece by piece, and with it, a sense of hope I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember. But the repairs weren't the only thing on Ethan and his father's agenda. As the workers bustled around the house, James had been making phone calls, his voice low and serious as he spoke to people I didn't know. Every now and then, I caught snippets of his conversations, mentions of labor board investigations and illegal practices. It didn't take long for me to figure out that James was doing more than just fixing my house. He was digging into the farm, into the way Michael had been running things, and from the look on his face, whatever he was finding wasn't good. Later that afternoon, James pulled Ethan aside, and the two of them disappeared around the back of the house to talk in private. I stayed on the porch, pretending not to notice, but my curiosity was eating me alive. What were they planning? What were they going to do about Michael? An hour later, my answer arrived, though not in the way I expected. I was sitting on the porch, sipping a glass of lemonade, when I heard the familiar roar of an engine approaching down the road. But this time, it wasn't the smooth purr of a Mercedes. No, this was the angry, sputtering sound of a truck that had seen better days, and I knew instantly who it belonged to. Michael. I stood up, my heart racing as his rusted farm truck barreled down the driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust in its wake. He wasn't alone. Another man sat beside him, one of his cronies, no doubt. They pulled to a screeching halt just feet from where I stood, and Michael practically leaped out of the truck, his face flushed with rage. "What the hell is going on here, Emma?" he spat, storming up the steps with all the grace of a bull. "You think you can just hire a bunch of contractors and ignore your obligations to the farm?" I froze, unsure how to respond, but before I could open my mouth, Ethan appeared at my side, his calm presence a stark contrast to Michael's fury. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Torrance?" Michael's eyes flicked toward Ethan, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of recognition in his gaze, like he knew who Ethan was, or at least had an idea of what was coming. But Michael wasn't the kind to back down easily. "You've got some nerve, coming here and messing with my workers," Michael sneered, jabbing a finger in Ethan's direction. "This woman works for Greenfield Farm. Her house? Her repairs? They're none of your concern. She owes us loyalty. You think you can just waltz in and play hero." Ethan didn't flinch. In fact, he stepped closer, his expression cool and measured. "Actually, I think you've been exploiting your workers for far too long, including Miss Emma. And as of this morning, the labor board has been notified about your practices." Michael's face paled, his bravado faltering for just a second, but he quickly recovered, his voice rising in fury. "You've got no idea what you're talking about. You don't know how things work around here." James appeared then, stepping out from behind the house, his phone still in hand. "Actually, Mr. Torrance, I do. I've been speaking with some very well-informed individuals about the way you've been running things. And from what I've gathered, you're looking at a full audit of the farm's finances and labor records. I suggest you prepare yourself." Michael looked like he'd been punched in the gut. He stammered, his face a mix of disbelief and rage, but no words came out. He was trapped, and he knew it. With one last glare, he stormed back to his truck, slamming the door so hard I thought it might fall off its hinges. As the truck sped away, kicking up dust behind it, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Ethan turned to me, his face softening. "It's over, Aunt Emma," He's not going to get away with it anymore. I stared at him, my heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and relief. The repairs on my house, the investigation into the farm. It was more than I could have ever asked for. And all of it, every single part, was because of a small act of kindness I had given to a lost boy so many years ago. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, something better. The repairs on my house were finally complete. It felt like a miracle, one I hadn't dared to believe in until I saw it with my own eyes. The sagging roof had been replaced, the cracks in the walls were filled, and even the creaky old porch had been reinforced. The fresh smell of wood and paint still lingered in the air, mixing with the familiar scent of the farm. Earthy, alive. For the first time in years, the house felt like a home again, not just a rundown reminder of everything that had gone wrong in my life. But it wasn't just the physical transformation that had my heart swelling with emotion. It was something deeper, a feeling that had been buried under years of hardship, now resurfacing with a force I wasn't prepared for. A sense of family, of belonging, of hope. It had all started with Ethan, that lost boy from the bus stop. Now here he was, standing beside me on my newly restored porch, looking out over the fields as the sun began to set. His father, James, was nearby, talking to the foreman about the last details of the project. The workers had packed up for the day, their laughter still echoing in the distance as they drove away. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air on my skin. For the first time in years, I wasn't dreading tomorrow. I wasn't worrying about whether the roof would leak when it rained, or if I'd have enough money to make it through the month. Things had changed, more than I could have ever imagined. Ethan leaned against the porch railing, his eyes thoughtful as he gazed out at the fields that stretched out beyond the horizon. The light from the setting sun cast a golden glow over everything, turning the world soft and warm, like a memory just out of reach. "Aunt Emma," he said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. He had taken to calling me that not long after he and his father arrived, and though it had surprised me at first, it felt right now like I was part of something bigger than just myself. "I've been thinking." I raised an eyebrow, sensing there was more to his words than casual conversation. "Oh? About what?" Ethan turned to face me, his expression serious but kind. "Dad and we were talking earlier. We've been coming here for a while now, and every time we visit, it feels more and more like home. I was wondering, would it be all right if we made it official? If we made this place our second home?" My heart skipped a beat, the weight of his words sinking in. A second home. For them? For me? The idea felt too good to be true, but I could see the sincerity in his eyes, the way he looked at me like I was part of his family. And in that moment, I realized that's exactly what I had become. A tear slipped down my cheek before I could stop it, but it wasn't from sadness. It was from the overwhelming sense of love that filled me. "Ethan," I said softly, my voice trembling, "you don't have to ask. You and your father are welcome here any time. This is your home as much as it is mine." He smiled, a wide, genuine smile that lit up his entire face. It was the same smile I remembered from all those years ago, when he had waved at me from the bus window, promising to see me again. He had kept that promise, and in doing so, he had brought more than just himself back into my life. He had brought family, something I had lost long ago. As we sat together, the sky fading from orange to deep purple, Ethan glanced at me, his eyes soft. "You know, Aunt Emma, I've thought about that day at the bus stop a lot. I was just a kid, scared and lost. I didn't know if I'd ever make it to my dad's, or if anyone would care enough to help me. But you didn't hesitate. You gave me what I needed without asking for anything in return." I felt my heart swell, remembering that day as if it were yesterday. "It was just a few dollars and some food," I said, my voice quiet. "It wasn't much." "It was everything," he said firmly. "To me, it was everything. That act of kindness, it changed the course of my life. I don't think I'd be here today if it wasn't for you." His words caught me off guard, and I blinked away the tears that threatened to spill over. I had never thought of it that way. To me, it had been a small gesture, something anyone would have done. But to Ethan, it had meant the world. You've done more for me than I could ever repay, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. And I want you to know that. I want you to know how much you mean to me. I reached out, taking his hand in mine, squeezing it gently. You've repaid me more than I could have ever imagined, Ethan. You and your father. You've given me more than just a roof over my head. You've given me family. That's something I can never thank you enough for. We sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of everything we had shared hanging in the air between us. It felt like a full circle, like all the pain, the struggle, the years of hardship had finally led to something beautiful, something worth holding on to. A few minutes later, James joined us on the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked between the two of us, a soft smile playing on his lips. I hear there's talk of making this place a second home, he said, his tone light but filled with meaning. I nodded, my heart full. That's right. You're both welcome here always. James stepped closer, placing a hand on my shoulder. We wouldn't want to be anywhere else, Emma. You've been through a lot, and I want you to know we're here for you for good. The three of us stood there for a long time, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting the last rays of light over the fields. It felt like a new chapter, one that had been a long time coming. I had spent years fighting to survive, to hold on to what little I had. But now, with Ethan and James by my side, I wasn't just surviving. I was living. As the evening settled into a comfortable quiet, Ethan turned to me one last time, his expression soft. You know, Aunt Emma, it's funny how life works out. You gave me a little milk, some pancakes, and a bus ticket all those years ago. And now here we are, full circle. I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me, a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Sometimes, I said softly, a small act of kindness is all it takes to change a life. And in that moment, as the stars began to twinkle overhead, I realized that kindness, pure, unselfish kindness, had brought me everything I had ever needed. Not just a roof over my head, but family, a place where I belonged. As we stood there together, the night settling in around us, I knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning.